Mick Jagger is 81 and still running. MetLife Stadium, New Jersey, June 2024. 60,000 people screaming like it's 1969. Keith Richards' guitar rips through the air like a chainsaw through velvet, and Mick, impossibly, absurdly, magnificently, erupts onto the stage. He doesn't walk. He doesn't strut. He sprints, hips moving in that strange, sacred rebellion against time itself. The crowd loses its mind, not in nostalgia, but in disbelief. How long can you run before the finish line starts chasing you? He grabs the microphone, doesn't even seem winded. That voice, still raspy, still dangerous, still somehow both masculine and feminine, human and alien, cuts through the noise. I can't get no satisfaction. And 60,000 people, from teenagers to grandparents, scream the words back at him like a prayer they've been saying their whole lives. This is what Mick Jagger does. This is what he's been doing for 62 years, defying, surviving, outlasting everyone. Backstage, 2 hours later, after running what biometric estimates suggest is 10 kilometers over the course of the show, Mick sits in his dressing room drinking green tea. He's wearing reading glasses. There's a book on the table, Yeats poetry. His personal trainer is reviewing tomorrow's workout schedule. In 4 days, they'll do this again in Philadelphia, then Chicago, then Los Angeles. 32 shows across North America. At 81, the secret, he says to a journalist who's been granted 15 minutes, don't stop. The moment you stop, you're done. Is eternal youth a triumph of discipline, or a prison built from rhythm and compulsion? Can you outdance death? Or does death simply wait, patient and amused, for the music to finally stop? This is the Mick Jagger paradox. The man who turned rebellion into an empire, who made chaos look like choreography, who transformed sex into philosophy and philosophy into swagger, who proved you could be both the devil and a knight, both animal and intellectual, both eternal and somehow more human than anyone who ever tried to be just one thing. But to understand how a working-class kid from Dartford became the most enduring symbol of rock and roll excess and longevity, we need to go back to where it started. Not on a stadium stage or in a luxury dressing room, but in post-war England, where a boy named Michael Philip Jagger learned that survival might require becoming someone else entirely. He was born on July 26, 1943 in Dartford, Kent, during a war that was reshaping the world. His father, Basil Fanshawe Jagger, was a physical education teacher, athletic, disciplined, proper. His mother, Eva, was Australian, warm but conventional. They lived in a modest house, raised Michael and his younger brother Chris in an environment that valued education, respectability, and fitting in. Young Mick fit in, mostly. He was bright, did well in school, showed no particular signs of future rebellion. He played cricket. He studied. When he won a scholarship to the London School of Economics in 1961 to study finance and accounting, it seemed like he was on the path his parents had imagined. Safe, respectable, middle-class British life. Even rebellion, he would learn, requires training. But something was already stirring. Mick had discovered American blues, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry. Music that was raw, sexual, dangerous in ways that polite British society couldn't accommodate. He would listen to these records in his room, trying to understand how sound could contain that much life, that much hunger, that much uncompromising truth. In 1960, on a train platform, he ran into Keith Richards, a kid he'd known briefly in primary school. Keith was carrying guitar chords under his arm. Blues and rock and roll, the same music that was obsessing Mick. They started talking, started playing, started imagining. If Keith was fire, Mick was oxygen. Within 2 years, they'd formed a band called the Rolling Stones. The name came from a Muddy Waters song, Rollin' Stone Blues, and it captured something essential about what they wanted to be. Not settled, not static, not respectable. Rolling, moving, refusing to be pinned down or defined or tamed. In the beginning, they weren't trying to be famous, they were trying not to be bored. The early 1960s in England were gray, conformist, still recovering from the war's trauma. Young people were supposed to get jobs, get married, replicate their parents' lives. But Mick and Keith and the other Stones, Brian Jones, Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, wanted something else. They wanted the feeling they got from American blues, that sense of being alive in a way that respectable society couldn't comprehend. The Beatles had already happened by then. They were the acceptable face of youth rebellion, charming, funny, unthreatening in their matching suits. The establishment could handle the Beatles. They were like sons who'd gone slightly astray but could still be brought back to Sunday dinner. The Rolling Stones were different. From the beginning, they positioned themselves as the anti-Beatles. Darker, dirtier, more dangerous. Where the Beatles sang, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," the Stones sang, "Let's Spend the Night Together." Where the Beatles were lovable, the Stones were fuckable. Where the Beatles represented light, the Stones represented shadow. And Mick, awkward, angular Mick with his big lips and strange dancing and androgynous energy, became the face of this darkness. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Paul McCartney. He was weird-looking, sexual in ways that defied easy categorization. When he moved on stage, it was unsettling, provocative, somewhere between ballet and obscenity. Critics hated it, parents were horrified, and young people, especially young women, couldn't look away. Satisfaction changed everything. Released in 1965, it was a song about frustration, about desire that couldn't be fulfilled, about the gap between what capitalism promised and what it delivered. The riff, Keith's genius, that insistent, grinding, perfect riff, was instantly recognizable. But it was Mick's delivery that made it revolutionary. He didn't sing the song, he snarled it, spat it, made it sound like a complaint and a threat and a seduction all at once. And when the world heard it, something shifted. Here was a song, and a performer, that didn't pretend everything was okay, that didn't smooth over the rough edges, that didn't try to make rebellion palatable. When Satisfaction hit number 1, the world recognized something it had been trying to ignore. A star doesn't need to be beautiful. A star just needs to be real. Through the mid to late 1960s, the Rolling Stones became the soundtrack to a cultural revolution they didn't entirely understand, but somehow embodied perfectly. Paint It Black, Sympathy for the Devil, Gimme Shelter. Songs that captured something about the darkness underneath the summer of love, about the violence that lurked beneath peace signs and flower power. Mick was becoming more than a singer. He was becoming an icon of transgression, someone who represented everything parents feared their children might become. He wore makeup. He wore women's clothing sometimes. He moved his body in ways that suggested sex acts banned by decency laws. He took drugs, lots of drugs, and didn't pretend otherwise. In 1967, Mick and Keith were arrested for drug possession in a case that became a cause célèbre. The establishment was trying to make an example of them, to show that the Stones' rebellion had consequences. Mick was sentenced to 3 months in prison for possessing 4 amphetamine tablets. The sentence was absurd, punitive, clearly designed to punish him for being Mick Jagger rather than for any actual crime, and it backfired spectacularly. Even the Times of London, conservative establishment, everything the Stones were against, published an editorial titled "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?", arguing that the sentence was excessive and motivated by moral panic rather than justice. Mick served 1 night in prison before the sentence was overturned on appeal. But something had changed. He had become almost accidentally a symbol of generational conflict, of the old order trying and failing to control the new. This is when the contradiction at the heart of Mick Jagger began to emerge fully. On one hand, he was the avatar of chaos, of hedonism, of fuck the establishment rebellion. On the other hand, he was increasingly the person managing that chaos, controlling it, turning it into a business. Keith Richards would later say, "Keith was chaos, I was management." It's a perfect distillation of their dynamic. Keith embodied the life they were supposed to be living. Drugs, recklessness, pure rock and roll with no thought for tomorrow. Mick lived that life too, certainly, but he also thought about set lists and contracts and tour logistics. Keith wrote the myth. Mick made sure it got royalties. He was the economics student from the London School of Economics, except instead of analyzing corporations, he was running one. The Stones weren't just a band, they were an empire. And Mick was the emperor, even if he looked like a demon. December 6, 1969. Altamont Speedway, California. The Rolling Stones were headlining a free concert that was supposed to be the West Coast's answer to Woodstock, a celebration of peace and music and the counterculture at its zenith. It became instead the day rock and roll lost its innocence. The Hells Angels, hired as security in exchange for beer, were violent and out of control. The crowd was packed too tightly. Bad acid was circulating. The atmosphere was tense, dangerous, wrong. And then, while Mick was singing Under My Thumb, a young man named Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death by a Hells Angel member just feet from the stage. That night, rebellion bled. Mick saw it happen. Kept singing. What else could he do? Stop the show and cause a riot? Keep going and ignore a murder? There was no right choice, so he made the only choice he could. He continued performing, trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled into chaos. The footage exists. You can watch it. Mick, in a ridiculous orange and black striped shirt, trying to calm the crowd, trying to keep the music going, trying to prevent complete catastrophe. He looks young and terrified and somehow still in control. "Brothers and sisters, why are we fighting?" he says into the microphone, as if reason could penetrate the violence. It couldn't. Altamont marked the end of something. The naive belief that rock and roll was inherently good, that gathering young people together would automatically create peace and love. The Stones, who had always traded in darkness, had summoned something they couldn't control. But before Altamont, there had been Hyde Park, July 5, 1969. 2 days after Brian Jones, the Stones' founder and original leader, had been found dead in his swimming pool. The concert was hastily repurposed as a memorial, a goodbye to Brian and a statement that the Stones would continue despite the tragedy. Mick arrived on stage wearing a white, Greek-style tunic designed by Michael Fish, looking like some androgynous angel or demon. The line between the two was always blurry with Mick. His hair was long, his movements fluid. Before the music started, he read from Shelley's Adonais, an elegy for Keats. "Peace, peace, he is not dead, he doth not sleep, he hath awakened from the dream of life." Then, as the band began to play, roadies released thousands of white butterflies. It should have been magical, but the butterflies, purchased from a supplier and kept in boxes for too long, were weak, dying. Many fell immediately to the stage floor. Others flew erratically, disoriented. It was supposed to be a moment of transcendence and became instead something stranger, more unsettling. Beauty and death intermingled, the dream and the nightmare inseparable. Mick performed through it all, butterflies landing on him, dying around him. The crowd of several 100,000 people swaying in the summer heat. Photographs from that day show him arms outstretched, white fabric flowing, butterflies circling. Looking like a priest or a sacrifice conducting a ritual whose meaning no one fully understood. It was peak Mick. Theatrical, sexual, spiritual, slightly ridiculous, completely mesmerizing. And it captured something essential about his position. He wasn't just a performer. He was a conduit for something larger, something that mixed beauty and violence, celebration and mourning, life and death in ways that defied easy categorization. Mick would rarely speak about Altamont in detail afterward. It haunted him clearly. The knowledge that his performance, his band, his music had been the backdrop for death. That the Dionysian energy he'd spent years cultivating had, for one horrible day, manifested as actual violence rather than symbolic rebellion. "We were never the devil," he would say years later. "We just sang his songs." But after Altamont, something changed. The Stones became more professional, more controlled, more aware that the chaos they were selling could have real consequences. Mick, in particular, began to separate performance from reality more clearly. On stage, he could still be the writhing demon, the embodiment of every repressed desire and forbidden impulse. Off stage, he became increasingly careful, disciplined, strategic. The 1970s were the Stones' imperial phase. Sticky Fingers, 1971, with its Andy Warhol-designed zipper cover, an actual working zipper on the front of the album positioned over a male crotch, was a perfect Stones provocation. Art, sex, and commerce fused into something that was simultaneously high and low, sophisticated and vulgar. Exile on Main Saint, 1972, was messy, sprawling, recorded in Keith's basement in France where the band had fled to escape British taxes. It was brilliant in its chaos, capturing something about what it felt like to be untethered from any fixed identity or home. Through this period, Mick's personal life was as chaotic as the music suggested. He married Bianca Perez Mora Macias in 1971, a Nicaraguan socialite who was as glamorous and commanding as he was. Their wedding in Saint-Tropez was the social event of the year, attended by everyone from Paul McCartney to Brigitte Bardot. Bianca arrived in a white suit and wide-brimmed hat, looking like she owned not just the day, but the decade. They had a daughter, Jade, in October 1971. For a moment, it seemed like Mick might settle into something resembling conventional domesticity. But the marriage was turbulent from the start. Bianca was strong-willed, refused to be an accessory to Mick's life, demanded to be treated as an equal. Mick, used to women who accommodated his schedule and his affairs, found this both attractive and intolerable. They became fixtures at Studio 54 in New York, at Warhol's factory, at every party that mattered in the 1970s cultural landscape. Photographs from this era show them impossibly beautiful, impossibly thin, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But in interviews years later, Bianca would describe those years as lonely, disconnected, a performance of glamour that masked profound unhappiness. Mick was rarely home, touring, recording, having affairs, most famously with model Jerry Hall, who would become his next long-term partner. Bianca filed for divorce in 1978, citing Mick's adultery. The settlement was expensive but not devastating to Mick's finances, which had grown enormous through shrewd management and relentless touring. He would have 8 children with 5 different women over the course of his life. The last, a son named Devereaux, born when Mick was 73 years old. Think about that. 73. An age when most men are grandfathers several times over. Mick was changing diapers. It's another contradiction in a life built on contradictions. On one hand, this pattern of serial monogamy punctuated by infidelity, of children spread across decades and continents, suggests someone incapable of traditional commitment, always moving, always rolling. On the other hand, by all accounts, Mick takes fatherhood seriously. He's financially generous with his children, emotionally present in ways his own father wasn't. Several of his children have spoken publicly about him with affection and respect. But what does it mean to be a good father when you're Mick Jagger? When your job requires you to embody eternal youth and sexual availability? When the brand you've built over 6 decades is fundamentally incompatible with being a responsible parent? These tensions remain unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. There had been many affairs. Marianne Faithfull was perhaps the most famous, a singer and actress who became both muse and cautionary tale. She and Mick were together from 1966 to 1970, a relationship that coincided with his most creative and self-destructive period. When they met, Marianne was 18. ethereal, singing "As Tears Go By" in a voice that sounded like innocence itself. Mick was 23 and already famous, already dangerous. He saw in her something he wanted, not just sexually, though there was that, but symbolically. She represented the kind of beauty and vulnerability that made his darkness look darker, his rebellion more rebellious. For 4 years, they were the couple that defined the era. Photographed everywhere. Beautiful in that particularly 1960s way. Thin, androgynous, fashionable. But behind the images, the relationship was corrosive. Mick was controlling, unfaithful, emotionally distant in ways that Marianne, young and desperately in love, couldn't navigate. She began using heroin. Her career stalled. Her mental health deteriorated. In 1969, she attempted suicide while on holiday with Mick in Australia. She survived, barely. The relationship limped on for another year before ending in mutual exhaustion and recrimination. Marianne would spend years recovering, rebuilding her life and career, processing what had happened to her in Mick's orbit. She would later say, "Mick never loved women. He loved what women did to his songs." It's a devastating assessment, and one that captures something essential about Mick's relationships. The women in his life, and there were many, often felt used, transformed into material, their pain and beauty converted into lyrics and performances. Marianne became wild horses, and you can't always get what you want. But what did she get in return? Fame, certainly. Association with genius, maybe. But also damage that took decades to heal. Years later, when both were older and the wounds had scabbed over, Marianne would say something more generous. He was young. We were all young. Nobody knew what they were doing. But the generosity couldn't completely erase the truth underneath. That Mick Jagger in his youth consumed people the way his performances consumed stages. Completely. Without apparent remorse. He collected them, models, actresses, society women, the way some people collect art. They enhanced his image, inspired his music, confirmed his status, but did he love them as individuals, as equals? The evidence is mixed. He would have 8 children with 5 different women over the course of his life. The last, born when he was 73. A pattern of serial monogamy punctuated by infidelity, of relationships that burned bright and ended messy, of women who entered his orbit and left changed, often damaged by the experience. And yet many of them speak fondly of him still. Describe him as charming, intelligent, genuinely interested in ideas and art and conversation. Not just the rock star, but the person underneath, who read poetry and went to museums and could discuss politics and philosophy. The contradiction again, the beast and the gentleman, the libertine and the father, the man who sang about sympathy for the devil and the man who worried about his children's education. Through the 1980s and 1990s, something interesting happened. The Rolling Stones became an institution. The rebellion they represented became historical rather than current. Young people discovered them as classic rock rather than as dangerous outsiders. Their tours became massive, corporate, extraordinarily profitable operations that grossed hundreds of millions of dollars. Rock died young. Mick turned it into a pension plan. And Mick became increasingly a businessman who happened to perform rock and roll rather than a rock and roller who happened to make money. He understood branding before most musicians did. Understood that the Stones' value wasn't just in their music but in what they represented. Eternal youth, eternal rebellion, eternal refusal to grow old gracefully. The rebel who once defied fathers became the father figure of rebellion, which meant he couldn't grow old. Not visibly. Not in any way that would undermine the brand. So Mick did something that seemed impossible. He maintained his body and his voice and his energy with the discipline of an elite athlete. While Keith Richards embraced the lifestyle, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, living embodiment of rock and roll excess, Mick ran, lifted weights, did yoga, ate carefully, stopped drinking to excess, quit drugs. He didn't stop aging, he choreographed it. He became, in effect, a health-conscious fitness enthusiast who cosplayed as a rock god several times a year on tour. The contradiction was almost funny. Backstage before shows, green juice, stretching, vocal warm-ups. On stage, writhing, sweating, simulated sex acts. Enough energy to power a small city. The discipline is extraordinary. Mick runs 6 to 8 miles several times a week. Not jogging, running at pace, pushing his heart rate into zones that would concern doctors for men half his age. He works with personal trainers who design ballet-based exercises to maintain flexibility and core strength. He does yoga, both for physical suppleness and mental focus. He works with vocal coaches before every tour to ensure his voice can handle the demands of 2-hour performances night after night. His diet is carefully controlled. Mostly fish and vegetables, minimal red meat, no excess sugar or alcohol. He drinks green tea instead of coffee, takes supplements, gets regular medical checkups that would make a hypochondriac look casual. His body is a machine, maintained with the kind of obsessive attention usually reserved for Formula One race cars. Friends who've watched this transformation over decades describe it with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Keith Richards, who famously lived the lifestyle without apparent consequence, has said, "I don't know how he does it. All that running around, what's he running from?" It's meant as a joke, but there's an edge to it. Keith's authenticity, his refusal to compromise or concede to age, makes Mick's discipline look like fear, like he's trying to outrun something that Keith has accepted. Mortality, irrelevance, the end. But maybe that's unfair. Maybe Mick's discipline is its own form of rebellion, against the rock and roll myth that says you have to burn out to be real, that destruction is more authentic than preservation. Maybe choosing to survive, to maintain, to keep performing at 81 when everyone expected you to be dead by 30 is the ultimate fuck you to a culture that romanticizes early death. In 2003, Mick was knighted by Prince Charles. Sir Mick Jagger. It was absurd. The man who had represented everything anti-establishment now officially recognized by the British monarchy. Keith Richards refused to attend, calling the whole thing a fucking piss take. He said, "It's strange to see Mick in a suit that doesn't have sweat on it." But Mick accepted it without apparent irony. "I earned this with rhythm, not respectability," he said. Which is true in its way. He hadn't changed to deserve the knighthood. The establishment had changed to accommodate him, had decided that rebellion, when it's profitable enough, when it's historical enough, when it's controlled enough, can be honored rather than feared. The knighthood crystallized something about Mick's position. He had won. Had outlasted all the moral panic and pearl-clutching and predictions of doom. Had turned a threat into a brand, chaos into choreography, danger into nostalgia. He had proven that you could have it all. The rebellion and the respect, the wildness and the wealth, the image and the empire. But what had been lost in that transformation? What part of the young man who wanted to sing the blues because it made him feel alive had been sacrificed to create Sir Mick Jagger, rock's most enduring businessman performer? These are questions Mick doesn't particularly entertain publicly. In interviews, he's charming but guarded, willing to tell the same anecdotes from 50 years ago but rarely revealing anything truly personal or vulnerable. He performs intimacy without offering it, the same way he's performed rebellion without truly threatening anything for decades now. Keith Richards, in his memoir Life, was more honest and therefore more cruel. He described Mick as someone who had chosen image over authenticity, control over chaos, business over art. Their relationship had been strained for years. The creative tension that made their partnership work also made it painful. Keith was the real thing, messy and self-destructive and pure. Mick was the manager, the calculator, the one who'd chosen survival over legend. The book, published in 2010, created a genuine rift. Keith didn't hold back. He described Mick as having a small penis, called him vain, controlling, obsessed with money, suggested that the Stones could continue without him. The insults were juvenile but also devastating because they came from the one person whose opinion Mick actually cared about. For months they didn't speak. Tours were in jeopardy. The partnership that had lasted nearly 50 years seemed finally permanently broken. But gradually, carefully, they found their way back to each other. Not through apologies, neither man was capable of that kind of vulnerability, but through music. They needed each other still. Keith's guitar needed Mick's voice. Mick's ambition needed Keith's authenticity. The Stones without both of them wasn't the Stones at all. When they finally spoke publicly about the reconciliation, both men downplayed it. "Brothers fight," Mick said with a shrug. Keith was more poetic. "We're welded together, can't unweld that." It was as close to tenderness as either would allow, because Keith had said what everyone suspected, that Mick had sold out so long ago and so thoroughly that he'd forgotten he'd done it. That the performance of being Mick Jagger had replaced actually being anyone at all. Is it true? Partly, maybe, but it's also incomplete. Because what Keith's critique misses is that Mick's discipline, his calculation, his ruthless management is what kept the Stones going. Keith's chaos is romantic. But Mick's control is what allowed them both to still be performing 60 years later. Keith's authenticity would have killed the band by 1975. Mick's sellout is why they're still filling stadiums in 2024. And maybe that's its own kind of authenticity. Maybe refusing to romanticize self-destruction, choosing life over legend, outlasting everyone who said rock and roll was for the young. Maybe that's the ultimate rebellion. In 2019, Mick had heart surgery, a valve replacement. At 75 years old, mortality finally announced itself. Not dramatically, he recovered quickly, was back on stage within months, but undeniably. The body, no matter how well maintained, eventually fails. His heart valve may be titanium, but the beat is still blues. The tour that followed was called No Filter. A joke, maybe, or a dare. What would the Rolling Stones look like without filters, without the myth-making, without the performance of eternal youth? They looked, it turned out, old. Mick moved a little slower. Keith looked like he'd been dead for 20 years but was too stubborn to admit it. Ronnie Wood was in recovery. Charlie Watts was visibly frail, but they could still play. That was the revelation. Strip away the mythology, acknowledge the age, admit the mortality, and underneath was still the music. Still the chemistry between Mick and Keith, that magical thing that had existed since 1960 on a train platform in Dartford. Still the songs that had soundtracked 6 decades of other people's lives. Charlie Watts died in 2021. The Stones' drummer for nearly 60 years, the quiet center around which their chaos orbited, gone. The band paused, mourned. And then, because they were the Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger was Mick Jagger, they continued. Hired a new drummer, went back on tour because stopping would mean admitting it was over, and Mick couldn't admit that. Wouldn't, maybe physically couldn't. "There's no retirement for those who still hear the noise," he'd written in a private note that later became public. It captures something essential about his relationship to performing. It's not a choice anymore, if it ever was. It's a compulsion. The noise, the roar of the crowd, the thrum of Keith's guitar, the pulse of the rhythm section is what keeps him alive. Without it, what would he be? Just another old man, wealthy and famous, but finished. With it, he's Mick Jagger. As long as he can run across that stage, as long as he can hit those notes, as long as 60,000 people scream like he's still dangerous, he's alive. Is that freedom? Or the most sophisticated prison ever constructed? At 81, Mick maintains a workout regimen that would exhaust most 30-year-olds. He runs for miles, does ballet-based exercises for flexibility, works with vocal coaches to maintain his range, studies video of his old performances to replicate moves he invented 60 years ago. Every show is planned with military precision. The set list, the staging, the moments for spontaneity that are actually carefully choreographed. He is, in effect, a living tribute to himself, the performer performing the performance of performing. And he's extraordinary at it. When you watch him on stage now at 81, moving with energy that seems impossible, you're witnessing something genuinely remarkable. Not just athletic prowess, though that's part of it, but the will required to maintain that level of performance, to refuse to accept the limitations that age imposes, to literally run against time. "I'd rather be dead than singing Satisfaction at 40, he'd said in 1964. Now he's singing it at 81, and 60,000 people are screaming the words back at him, grateful that he broke that particular promise. What does it mean that our culture's most enduring symbol of rebellion is a businessman in his 80s performing songs about youth and danger and sex for an audience of aging baby boomers and their nostalgic children? That the revolution became a brand, the danger became a theme park, the wildness became choreographed and controlled and safe. Mick Jagger doesn't answer these questions. He's too busy running, too busy performing, too busy proving that he's not done, that the noise hasn't stopped, that time hasn't won. Not yet. Not while he can still move, still sing, still make 60,000 people forget for 2 hours that they're mortal. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's more than enough. Maybe the man who turned rebellion into longevity, chaos into craft, danger into discipline has achieved something more interesting than authenticity. Maybe he's proven that you don't have to choose between art and survival, between being real and being successful, between the beast and the businessman. Or maybe he's just proven that if you run fast enough, death can't catch you. At least not yet. At least not while the music's playing. And the music is always playing. The tour continues. Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles. 32 shows across North America, then Europe, then South America, then Asia. Always moving, always rolling. The band that refused to be a rolling stone by becoming one. Never settling, never static, never stopping long enough to let reality catch up. Backstage, in quiet moments between performances, Mick keeps a diary. He's kept one since 1962, recording not just what happened, but how it felt, what he was thinking, who he was becoming. It's not for publication, not for posterity, just for him. A way of marking time, of proving he's still here, still conscious, still something more than the performance. Off stage, silence waits like an unpaid bill. "I'm not rebelling against society," he wrote in 1968. "I'm society showing its reflection." "Everyone wanted to save rock and roll," he wrote in 1989. "I just wanted to dance." "The secret of longevity," he wrote in 2015, "outdance death." And in 2024, after another show, another stadium, another victory over time, "I'm not immortal, I just refuse to prove it." He sits in his dressing room drinking green tea, reading Yeats. Tomorrow he'll run 6 miles, do 90 minutes of yoga, rehearse for 3 hours, then do it all again on stage. The discipline required to maintain the illusion of wild freedom is extraordinary. But that's the paradox he's lived inside for 6 decades. True freedom requires absolute control. Does he ever want to stop? Does he ever imagine a life beyond the tour, beyond the performance, beyond being Mick Jagger? It's hard to say. In interviews, he deflects, makes jokes, changes the subject. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe the question doesn't make sense. Mick Jagger without performing isn't really Mick Jagger at all. It's just an old man named Michael Jagger, and who the hell is he? The genius of Mick's survival is that he figured this out early. That the only way to defeat time was to refuse its terms. Not to age gracefully, not to accept limitations, not to transition into elder statesman or nostalgia act. Just to keep being exactly what he'd always been, only more so, only harder, only with more discipline and calculation and sheer force of will. He's the man who made rebellion sustainable, who proved that you could be the devil in a night, chaos and control, wild and wealthy, who showed that the ultimate rebellion isn't dying young and leaving a beautiful corpse. It's living until you're 81 and still making people believe you're dangerous. Can you really outdance death? Or does death simply wait, patient and amused, knowing the music has to stop eventually? These are the questions Mick Jagger has been asking with his body, his voice, his relentless refusal to stop for 62 years. And he still doesn't have an answer. Or maybe he does, and the answer is, not yet. Ask me again after the next show, and the next, and the next. The tour rolls on. The stone keeps rolling. And somewhere in a stadium in Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles, 60,000 people are waiting to scream like it's 1969, like rebellion still means something, like youth is eternal if you just believe hard enough. And Mick will run onto that stage, 81 years old, and make them believe it. Because that's what he does. That's all he's ever done. Turn belief into performance, performance into reality, reality into myth, myth into business, business into art, art into life, life into fuel for the next performance. It's exhausting just thinking about it. But Mick doesn't have the luxury of exhaustion. He has shows to play, miles to run, death to outrun. And somewhere Keith Richards, somehow still alive, somehow still Keith, is tuning his guitar, ready to provide the riff that will make Mick move, that will trigger the muscle memory of 60 years, that will start the whole beautiful, terrible machine again. They take the stage. The lights hit red. 60,000 people scream. And Mick Jagger, impossibly, absurdly, magnificently, begins to run. He's still running? Maybe immortality isn't about never dying. Maybe it's about never finishing the song. When rebellion becomes a brand, can it still be rebellion? When immortality becomes a business, can you ever afford to die? And if the music never stops, does silence still mean death or mercy?